In this video, we're going to look at some of the challenges and objections that arise regarding Descartes' conceivability argument for dualism. We'll start out by giving a brief overview of the overall structure of Descartes' conceivability argument for dualism. Then the first challenge we will look at aims to show that there are counterexamples to conceivability as a good test of possibility. Then we'll look at another challenge that tries to claim that the only reason we can conceive of mind existing without body is because our ideas are sort of confused or clouded. Then we'll turn to a famous problem for dualism more generally, known as the interaction problem, where we discuss the relationship between mind-body interaction, body-mind interaction, and how this leads to a kind of mysteriousness amongst dualist views. Then we'll briefly close with some discussion of Occam's razor yet again. So Descartes starts his conceivability argument by claiming that we can conceive of a situation where a mind exists without our physical body or brain. Now, I don't think that the sort of legs that I see, the hands that I see and feel and touch and smell and taste, I don't think that those are just an illusion sort of in my mind due to an evil genius. I think that's rather outlandish. But nonetheless, I can imagine that scenario where all of this is an illusion. Similarly, I don't believe I'm ever going to sort of wake up and go to my bathroom and then sort of see sort of nothing in my, sort of no reflection in my mirror, and then look down and see no body, like in the example from one of the previous videos involving the mirror. But despite how outlandish that scenario is, I can still follow the story. I still understand what it's asking me to imagine. Unlike when someone asks me to imagine a married bachelor. I can't even conceive of that situation. And now the idea though is, well, since we can conceive of something, that thereby shows that it's possible, that there's no logical contradiction in the idea. So, from these two premises, it follows that it's possible for our mind to exist without our body or brain. So even if it never happens, it's still possible. But the idea is, if the mind was just a physical body, if it was just your brain, then it wouldn't even be possible. It would be impossible for your mind to exist without your physical body or your brain. Thus, in order to account for this possibility, even if it never happens, we have to conclude that the mind is not the same thing as the body or even a particular body like the brain. So the first problem with this argument is that many people worry that our ability to conceive of something or imagine something is not always a good reason to think that it's possible. There appear to be some examples where we can imagine something occurring even though it's actually impossible. For instance, Lois Lane might be able to imagine a world where Superman exists, but Clark Kent doesn't. But that's not really possible even though she can imagine it, because unbeknownst to Lois Lane, Superman and Clark Kent are two names for the very same person. Similarly, if a student hasn't yet seen the proof of the Pythagorean theorem, they might think that they can conceive of a right triangle where the square of its hypotenuse is unequal to the square of its two other sides, even though that's mathematically impossible, at least within Euclidean geometry. Now, a person back in the year 1700, so this is about 80 years before we discovered the atomic composition of a water molecule, they might have been able to imagine, conceive of a situation where we do some experiments and we discover that water is composed of molecules made up of 3 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. Nonetheless, even though they could imagine that, it wasn't actually possible because water and H2O are the same thing, just like Superman and Clark Kent are the same person. And so this shows that not everything we can conceive of are genuine possibilities. And so we shouldn't jump to the conclusion just because we can conceive of the mind existing without the body, that it's thereby possible. So if Descartes wants to defend the conceivability argument from this objection, Descartes needs to first give some way to distinguish when our ability to conceive of something is evidence that it's really possible and when it's not. So why is it that my ability to conceive of a 100-foot copy of Descartes' Meditation is a good reason to think that it's possible, but Lois Lane's ability to imagine Superman without Clark Kent is not a good reason to think that it's possible. Moreover, Descartes needs to defend the claim that our ability to conceive of the mind without the body is one of those good cases where it really is evidence of a possibility. So Descartes had a reply to this challenge. He claimed that our ability to conceive of a situation shows that it's possible if the ideas we're using are sort of complete and adequate or clear and distinct. There's sort of no confusion in our ideas. And the idea is we have a clear idea of the mind as a thinking thing and a clear idea of bodies or physical things as extended things. But in the previous cases, the person was only able to conceive of something that turned out to be impossible because they had a limited, unclear, or confused idea of Clark Kent and Superman. Lois Lane just didn't know everything about Clark Kent and Superman, and so had a sort of confused idea of both persons. The student who conceived of a right triangle that violated Pythagorean's theorem had a confused and incomplete idea of right triangles. And the person who's sort of working with an idea of water before we've discovered its sort of chemical composition is working with a limited and sort of confused idea of water. And that's why they were able to imagine these impossible situations. But when we imagine mind existing without body, Descartes thinks we have a clear and distinct conception of both those things, and so our ability to conceive of that situation shows that it's possible. But this leads to another problem. How can we actually be confident that our ideas of the mind and body are not sort of confused and clouded, just like Lois Lane's ideas of Superman and Clark Kent? There's a whole lot I don't know about how the human mind works. There's a whole lot that I don't know about the human brain. No scientist knows everything about the human brain. And so maybe the reason we can imagine the mind existing without the brain is just because we're sort of ignorant of the true nature of physical things or of mental things. So for instance, remember the example of students who initially say they can conceive of a round square. The reason that they're able to do this is because they think that they have a clear idea of a round square. They're imagining that sort of square-like thing with rounded corners. But in reality, they're wrong. Their idea is actually confused. And so here, those worries with Descartes' gloss on the mind and the body become quite important. So remember, Descartes said, here's a clear idea of the mind. It's a thinking thing. Here's a clear idea of bodies or physical things. They have extension, take up space. But now there's those worries that show, well, maybe those aren't the best way to think about mind and body because, well, imagine the person who goes to sleep at night has a dreamless sleep. Does their mind pop out of existence when they go to sleep and then pop back into existence? That doesn't seem right. It seems like their mind still exists even when it's not sort of thinking, when they're having this dreamless sleep. Similarly, in physics, nowadays, we appeal to all kinds of things that don't have extension, like point particles, like electrons, or fields like magnetic fields or gravity that don't have any sort of specific sort of extension. They don't take up space. All right, so now, all of those are worries with Descartes' conceivability test of possibility. It's worries with a specific premise in his argument. But there's another problem with dualism that is often brought up. And this problem isn't directed at any one premise of Descartes' argument. Rather, it looks at the conclusion, the dualist view, and it claims that this conclusion leads to some implausible implications. And given their implausibility, that's some reason to think that the argument had to have gone wrong somewhere. Now, I like to introduce this problem by sharing a secret with my students, and so I'm going to share it with you too. Here it is. I have a superpower. Wait for it. Wait. I can move physical objects with the power of my mind. Wait, what? You don't believe me? All right, well, you're probably imagining the following kind of sort of telekinesis, like you see in these pictures. Someone sort of making a chair float using just their mind, or someone making a pop can float using just their mind, or a rock, or Yoda sort of having rocks float around him using just his sort of thought and mind. Well, my ability to move physical objects with my mind isn't quite as powerful as in those pictures, but it's just as real. In fact, you all have the power to move physical objects with your mind as well. And here, I'm going to give you a bit of training to help you discover this ability right now over this video. But first, let me just make sure that you are able to follow my instructions. So on the count of 3, I want you to raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. All right, so did you raise your hand? Did you follow my instructions? Well, if you did, all right, well, my work here is done then. You all just moved a physical object using your mind, using your thoughts. You thought about moving your hand, and that got your hand to move. Your thought is something that occurs in your mind. Your hand moving is a physical object. It's a body that moves as a result. Now, you probably think I'm cheating here. But notice, so our experience supports this idea that our mind and body interact with one another. And so dualism appears committed to this claim that an entirely non-physical entity that has no extension, no shape, no space, doesn't take up any space whatever, can interact with the physical body, and vice versa. The problem is that it becomes entirely mysterious how that interaction could take place. That interaction, if dualism is true, is just as mysterious as the telekinesis cases you imagined earlier. The ability of a non-physical mind to move your own physical body is just as mysterious as your non-physical mind moving some other body like a chair across the room. So let's just make sure. So here's some examples from experience to suggest that our mind and body really do interact. Firstly, there are cases where things that happen in our mind cause things to happen in our body. Call this mind-to-body interaction. So my thirst, I experience thirst in my mind, I feel it, and that causes my body to get out of my chair and walk to the fridge. A student's thinking that they're confused about dualism, about philosophy, causes them to hit the unmute button on Zoom and to move their mouth and ask a question. Your desire to pass this class, notice desires are mental things, desires are things that exist in your mind. It causes you to get out of bed, maybe, open your computer, sign on to Blackboard, and to push play on this video. Those are all things that your physical body did because of, as a result of, this desire that exists in your mind. Now, the interaction can go the other way, the opposite direction too. Things that happen in your body can cause things to happen in your mind. So you get kicked in the shin. That's something that happens to your body, and it causes you to feel, to experience pain in your mind. You take ibuprofen. You swallow a physical pill. That thing that happens in your body causes your headache, the experience of that headache in your mind, to go away. You drink alcohol, a physical sort of substance, and it causes your thoughts in your mind to sort of slow down and become fuzzy. Or a famous example that often comes up in sort of psychology classes is an iron rod got lodged into a person, Phineas Gage's, a railroad worker's, Phineas Gage's brain, and this physical damage to his brain caused his personality to change so much that those who knew him both before and after the accident described him as a completely different person. So the problem here is that it's unclear whether dualism can explain how the mind and the body interact with one another, given that one is entirely non-physical and the other is physical. If my mind is entirely non-physical and it's not located anywhere in space, then it can't make any contact or touch any part of my body, including my brain. So your mind, it's no closer to your body than it is to someone else's body, because your mind, it's just not anywhere. It's at no location. It's not in space. It has no shape. It has no size. It can't touch your brain or your body. So how does it get them to do things? My mind also can't transfer any electrical signals to my brain, since electrical signals are physical entities. You can't have electrical signals in your mind since electrical signals are physical things at physical locations. I mean, it doesn't even make sense really for anything to be stored in the mind. It can't store anything because it has no space. It doesn't take up any space, and so there's no place to put things to store them, like electrical signals. So dualism seems to imply that each of us is sort of telekinetic with our own body. Our thoughts somehow magically get maybe the neurons in our brains to sort of shoot off. And so, given that, it's utterly mysterious how our mind can get our body, including our brain, to do anything, and how the changes in our body, when we sort of maybe drink alcohol or take a sort of Advil, how that could cause anything to happen in our non-physical mind. How do you what kind of bridge could you build between the two? Now, the mystery of interaction can also be illustrated by various questions that arise on the dualist view, where it isn't clear how we could even attempt to answer these questions. So what kind of mechanism could possibly connect my mind to my body? So yet again, there has to be some kind of bridge to get information from the mind to the brain and then to the body, for instance, or from the brain to the mind. But what kind of thing could that bridge be? I don't even know where to start. Similarly, look, if my mind can move my body without touching it, making contact with it, or sending any physical signals to it, then why can't my mind directly move your body just by thinking about it? Or other physical objects such as tables and chairs? Yet again, you say it's connected to my body and it's not connected to those things, but how? It can't touch it? It can't make contact with it? It's not like located right next to my brain or in my brain. It has no location whatsoever. It's not physical. Now notice, these problems, these mysteries, completely disappear if you adopt physicalism. So if my thirst is just neurons firing in my brain, then we can look at neuroscience and we have clear explanations for how those neurons firing in my brain, the thirst, can thereby send signals throughout the central nervous system in my body and get my muscles to contract and thereby get my legs to move me to the fridge. Now, it's worse than this because even if the dualist develops a theory that would explain how non-physical minds interact with physical bodies, they give some theory about the bridge that connects the two, the physicalists could appeal to Occam's razor to say that their explanation is still the better one, because the dualist has to say, look, there are these neurons firing in your brain that send signals to your body and get the muscles to move. But they're going to say, but before those brain signals fire, there's the thirst in your mind, and that sort of somehow sends this, goes across the bridge and gets the brain to move. So there's this extra step on the dualist explanation. There's this extra layer of things going on, and thus the dualist makes the explanation for how your mind gets your body to move that much more complicated. And shouldn't we think that the simpler explanation, the physical explanation, is the more likely one, using Occam's razor? So that's it for our discussion of Descartes' dualism. Next week, we're going to look at functionalism about the mind, and this will lead us into also discussing, is it possible to build a computer that has a mind and understanding and thought in the same way that human beings are able to think about things and have a mind? See you then.